name is Venezie. I want to thank you all for having me today. I'm going to be talking about Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. The first time that I read Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, I was in middle school, and I very much took it at face value. I took it as a straightforward horror story. I vividly remembered the beating of the old man's heart, the typical frightening aspects. I vividly remembered the narrator killing the old man, and I walked away with typical things that most people do. And I reread it in an American literature class with Dr. Venezie, who I want to thank for encouraging me to submit this paper. And I also want to thank Jim Vincent for encouraging me and helping me with figuring all this out, as always. And I really took a very psychological perspective on Poe's work, and I feel like there's a lot lurking beneath the surface in the story, as Lauren said, as we've been taught to learn about literature. And my interpretation of Poe's The Telltale Heart is entitled A Telling Tale of Addiction. And to do justice to my paper, I'm going to basically read it to you and discuss parts of it as I read. And what I believe about The Telltale Heart is that it is a glimpse into the self-destructive nature of a drug addict. And the story is also a glimpse into a drug addict's attempt to rid himself of the addiction and the withdrawal issues he experiences because of that. Basically, The Telltale Heart is a story of the narrator's own self-destruction and a thinly veiled breakdown of an addict. Let's take into account the imagery and the tone of the story, which are very symbolic of the narrator's mental state, which is chaotic and paranoid. The narrator is incredibly paranoid and unable to concentrate on anything other than his paranoia. And I know I keep saying that word, but it's very important. He's very paranoid throughout the story. And he refers to himself continually as nervous. This is really where I got the idea for the whole drug addiction aspect at first, with this whole constant nervousness and shakiness and paranoia and being unable to calm down. I just imagine him in this sort of horrible pain of paranoia and uneasiness. That's really where the idea first stemmed from. And this nervousness, as I said, can be associated with the shaking and uneasiness that comes along with the withdrawal from a drug. In the time of withdrawal, one's senses are heightened. It is as if every feeling within one's body is intensified. The narrator addresses these things when he says, quote, "True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I have been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them." End quote. The narrator's words indicate his emotional mood swings and paranoia. He is unable to calm down, as some part of him always seems to be teetering on edge. Now, there are some key images and symbols that Poe utilizes in The Telltale Heart. First of all, of course, is the old man's eye. The eye haunts the narrator, as he says, quote, "One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold," end quote. Now, physically, this eye doesn't seem like it should be all that powerful or out of the ordinary, but the power it has over the narrator is extraordinary. As a reader, as an outsider, it's a bit hard to understand his obsession and his fascination with the eye, which I think is the point, basically. This is very similar to a drug. A drug can appear harmless enough, I suppose, but the power it has is something many find hard to stay away from, and many outsiders, the ones who aren't experiencing it, find it hard to understand. So the blue veil-covered eye represents the drug. It is the addiction, and it's what the narrator is trying to destroy within himself. And the veil covering the eye symbolizes the fact that the narrator's vision is being altered. This drug addiction is blurring and distorting his vision, causing him to see things differently, in almost a warped fashion. Essentially, the hatred the narrator has for himself is contained in that veil-covered eye. Now, you have to take into account who this veil-covered eye belongs to, which is the old man. This old man represents or symbolizes the narrator's alter ego. The dark side of drug addiction is revealed in the alter ego, and it is significant that this alter ego is an old man. It is the part of the narrator that is weak, vulnerable, and struggling, almost on the edge of death at any moment. The only phrase the old man ever utters in the entire story is when he hears someone enter his room late one night and he cries out, quote, "Who's there?" He has no fight in him and is the part of the narrator succumbing to the drug addiction. As evidenced by the narrator's obsession with the old man, this drug addiction is all the narrator knows, something that occurs with almost all addicts. As the narrator says, quote, "It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. I love the old man," end quote. The narrator explores the idea of both loving and hating the old man. As a drug addict, he both loves and hates what he's addicted to. That's the nature of addiction. Thus, the narrator must rip himself into figuratively to try and kill the part that ails him, i.e. the old man. The narrator addresses this idea when he says, quote, "I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the I forever," end quote. He wants to separate himself from the old man and the I because he wants to separate himself from and take the life out of the drug addiction. Now, on the night the narrator is to kill the old man, he focuses on the evil eye, and he hears a familiar sound. And this is the part of the story that many remember, as I said before, I vividly remembered. And this is the sound of the old man's heartbeat that he hears. And he says, quote, "There came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. It was the beating of the old man's heart," end quote. But I believe the heartbeat that the narrator hears is his own. The only noise that interrupts the sound of his own heartbeat is a groan. And he says, quote, "It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo, the terrors that distracted me. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart," end quote. And this is, I believe, the narrator's own groan, which is why he recognizes it. This is why he knows the sound well. This is why he knows what the old man feels and pities him. This is his very own groan that keeps him awake at night, his mind solely on addiction and his body going through withdrawal. And that is the terror that distracts him. So the narrator goes on to suffocate the old man, and it takes a bit of time, but he says that he finally ceases to hear the heartbeat, and quote, "The old man was dead, his eye would trouble me no more." In this moment, the narrator believes that he has triumphed over the addiction. The eye will trouble him no more. The drug will hound him no longer. The addiction will no longer be a part of him. He believes that he has successfully killed the alter ego. And the narrator goes on to disturbingly dismember the corpse, or, I believe, pick apart and figure out what parts of the alter ego he wants to keep within himself. Because the old man can't be all that bad, because as the narrator did, as I explored earlier, love parts of the old man. But even as the narrator believes he has beaten the addiction, his withdrawal symptoms return. As he says, quote, "But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. The ringing became more distinct," end quote. His body is not allowing him to stay calm. His withdrawal symptoms are back in full force. Maybe he has not beaten the addiction after all. As he says, quote, "Almighty God, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew, they were making a mockery of my horror," end quote. This is, again, a very famous part of the story, where the narrator keeps hearing the sound of the heartbeat, and he's pacing back and forth trying to block out the sound and pretend like it's not there, and the sound just keeps getting louder and louder. And again, this is very reminiscent of what I believe could be the withdrawal that's so painfully there and won't go away. And the narrator says, quote, "I felt that I must scream or die." And he's going through this horrible process of his body trying to rid itself of something and become accustomed to not having and depending on a drug. And it's just awful and painful process, and you can't hide from it or get away from it no matter what you do, no matter how you try to distract the sound of the heartbeat or talk over the sound of the heartbeat as he's doing. The incessant heartbeat that the narrator hears isn't his conscience. This is his addiction calling to him from the floorboards. So what I believe ultimately the message of the Telltale Heart is that once an addict, there is no true way out. Of course, that doesn't have to mean that one is actually doing the drug, but that monkey is liable to always remain on one's back. Edgar Allan Poe is known to have dabbled in drugs and could very well have been able to relate to the narrator's plight in this story. Poe could have understood that ultimately once one acquires the addiction, it is always going to stick around, no matter how hard one tries to suppress it. If the narrator's telltale heart is still beating, that being within him still exists. And that's why drug addiction is a disease, which he calls it earlier in the story. Try and bury it as secretly as possible, but if the narrator is still breathing, so is that old man.